Do you remember the last time you sprinted home because the streetlights came on? If you grew up in the 80s or 90s, you probably do. If you didn't, that sentence might sound like ancient history. That sprint home marked the end of an unstructured day. A day where your parents didn't always know where you were, where your brain was shaped by boredom, physical risk, and real-time social negotiation. Think about one of the biggest shows of the last decade, Stranger Things. The show opens with 4 boys playing Dungeons and Dragons in a basement. 1983. No phones, no internet, just dice, bikes, and the dark. Stranger Things didn't just sell a story, it sold a feeling. And millions of people who grew up with the internet felt something they couldn't quite name. Nostalgia for a childhood they never had. So what happens inside a mind that grows up never knowing that basement, that boredom, or a world before the screen? That's what we're exploring today. Because you are probably the one who've never truly known life offline. Or at least you know someone who doesn't. Probably your own kid. And if you're watching this, that shaped you in ways nobody ever sat you down and explained. In 2025, researchers published a study in the Journal of Psychiatry, finding that growing up immersed in digital technology physically alters the brain's dopamine reward pathways before age 18. Not metaphorically, structurally. This is what that does to a person. There's a specific experience that people who grew up with the internet share, and most of them have never heard it named. You learned how to be a person and how to perform being a person at the same time. Same device. Same room. The generation before, you figured out who they were first. Offline, with friction, boredom, and no audience watching. They came to the internet as adults, already formed, already knowing who they were. They carried their identity with them. You didn't get that. Your identity didn't form before the internet. It formed through it. A 2021 review, published in the Korean Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, described the current young generation as the first born into the ubiquitous influence of digital media, not introduced to it as adults, but born inside it. The smartphone, the study noted, became not a tool, but a lifeline, an identity anchor. That's not dramatic language, that's the clinical description. Here's what that actually did to your brain. Every notification, every like, every comment, every scroll. Your brain processed all of it as a reward signal, a hit of dopamine, a moment of social validation your nervous system registered as, I exist, I matter, people see me. A 2025 study by Masri Zada et al., published in the Journal of Psychiatry and Psychiatric Disorders on Social Media and Technology Impact on Adolescent Mental Health, examining 500 users over 6 months, found that people spending more than 2 hours a day on social media showed a 35% drop in prefrontal cortex impulse control. The prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for delayed gratification, emotional regulation, and long-term decision-making. And people who grew up with the internet weren't doing this at 25. They were doing it at 12, at 14, during the exact developmental window when that prefrontal cortex was still being built. This isn't a moral failure. It isn't weakness. It's architecture. You were handed a dopamine machine during a neurological construction phase, and your brain learned to expect instant feedback from the world. The result is a very specific kind of person, someone who feels deeply restless in silence, who finds it difficult to sit with a single thought without reaching for something, who feels a hollow discomfort when they post something and the response is nothing, not because they're vain, because their nervous system was wired to interpret that silence as rejection. But the dopamine wiring isn't the only thing the internet built in you. It also gave you an audience, before you were old enough to understand what identity even was. People who grew up offline had the privacy of bad decisions. They could be awkward, confused, contradictory, and none of it was captured. They could change, quietly, with no archive. You didn't get that privacy. Your adolescence was partially documented, commented on, liked, or ignored. And your brain was still forming during all of that, still asking, who am I? And slowly it started learning that identity was something you built for viewers, not something you discovered on your own. Psychologists call this audience-based identity formation, the first generation to develop a sense of self partly through public performance rather than private exploration. What does this create? A person who is genuinely, deeply self-aware, but who also struggles to know which version of themselves is real. Who feels most like themselves in a conversation, but oddly empty when no one's watching. Not fake, just calibrated to an audience that was always there. Here's the part that will name something you've probably never been able to put into words. You know more people than any human generation in history. More access to connection. More communication channels. More ways to reach someone at 3 a.m. than any person who ever lived. And you're lonelier. Not lonely in a simple way, in a very specific way. Lonely in rooms full of people you like. Lonely while texting someone. Lonely after a conversation that felt good, but left you hollow an hour later. A 2025 study published in the Annals of the New York Academy of Sciences found that digital natives, the generation born into the internet, showed the highest usage of social platforms, combined with the highest self-reported loneliness scores of any generational cohort studied. The researchers named it directly: quantity of digital connection consistently failed to produce the psychological satiety that in-person interaction did. Your brain was trained to seek connection through a screen. And screens, no matter how fast, no matter how vivid, don't produce what a physical human presence does. Oxytocin. Eye contact. The nervous system co-regulation of being in a room with someone who simply sees you. So you kept seeking. And the seeking kept leaving you just slightly short of full. And that gap, that specific hollow feeling, is exactly what the next part explains. Now here's what most psychology channels will never tell you. Everything I just described, the dopamine wiring, the performance identity, the connection paradox, those aren't only deficits. They're a specific form of psychological architecture that no previous generation has ever had. You are, arguably, the most adaptable human beings ever produced. You learned to read social environments at high speed because you had to. In comment sections and DMs and group chats where tone had no voice. You developed emotional intelligence not from a classroom, but from thousands of micro-interactions that required reading subtext in text. You learned to exist across multiple contexts, multiple versions, multiple registers, and while that sounds exhausting, what it built was cognitive flexibility. The ability to shift, to read a room, to translate yourself. A 2024 longitudinal study published in Nature's Scientific Reports, tracking children over 4 years using MRI brain scans, found that the effects of digital media on brain development were more nuanced than assumed, and that in specific domains, digitally immersed children showed measurable advantages in information processing speed and multi-context social navigation. You didn't grow up broken. You grew up calibrated to a world that nobody had maps for. And the disorientation you sometimes feel, that's not malfunction. That's the friction of being the first generation to navigate something genuinely new. People who grew up with the internet carry something the generations before them don't fully understand, and the generations after them won't fully feel. You were the test generation. The ones who learned what it means to be human in a world that suddenly had infinite memory, infinite audience, and infinite stimulation. You learn to perform before you learn to be. To connect before you learn to touch. To know more than any human before you, and to feel, sometimes, like none of it is enough. That's not a diagnosis. That's a description. And the fact that you're watching a video, trying to understand it, that's the exact thing that makes you different. If this named something real for you, describe it in one sentence in the comments. Just one. The loneliness, the restlessness, the performance, whatever landed hardest. You'll find you're not the only one who felt it, but never had the words. And if someone in your life grew up inside the internet the same way you did, send this to them. They'll know exactly what it means.